Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for the Soufan Center's webinar event, where we're taking a close look at how the weaponization of information online threatens democracy. And we're taking a close look, obviously, at disinformation, democracy, and dissent. My name is Emerita Torres, and I am the Director of Policy, Research, and Programs for the Soufan Center. We're a nonpartisan strategy center dedicated to increasing awareness of global security issues, both in the United States and around the world. We have been in the business of identifying trend lines before they become fault lines, and we've done so in several areas within global security, including the manipulation and the weaponization of information. What we know as disinformation campaigns can have wide-ranging impacts, from altering elections to encouraging acts of violence. The aggressive and persistent nature of some of the most sophisticated disinformation campaigns can often mean that they have a high chance of succeeding, at least to some degree. But underpinning these influence campaigns can be real danger, bringing online threats and disinformation to real-life physical threats and violence, as well as broader threats to democracy. For example, we are witnessing today how authoritarian and authoritarian-like regimes are using information operations online to censor and squash dissent, and even threaten violence, not only internally, but also outside of their countries, threatening both their critics and democratic values more broadly around the world. The Middle East provides several examples of autocratic leaders seeking to silence criticism. The murder of Washington Post reporter Jamal Khashoggi is one of the most notable and demonstrates how far some states will go to eradicate dissent. And we will discuss during the conversation how the founder of the Soufan Center, Ali Soufan, was also a target of a disinformation campaign with many similarities to the one that targeted Khashoggi on the heels of a credible threat against his life. China, Russia, and Iran have played key roles in information operations in an effort to thwart democratic appeal and values. The coronavirus pandemic is also laying bare a growing competition between democratic and authoritarian-like regimes. And all of this is happening as governments, the private sector, education institutions, media, and civil society organizations are trying to figure out what steps to take. So the goal of this conversation is really to explore these complex challenges, how they are connected, with the intention of making the online space safer for all. So we have a really impressive group of speakers with us today coming from different perspectives who will walk us through these issues. First, we have Dexter Filkins. He's a staff writer at The New Yorker and a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. He covered the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan for the New York Times, and his book, The Forever War, won the 2008 National Book Critics Circle Award for nonfiction and was named the best book of the year by several news outlets. Dina Hussein is the Counterterrorism and Dangerous Organizations Policy Manager at Facebook. She works at the intersection of diplomacy, security, and law on counterterrorism issues. She has over 10 years of experience as a policy and communications expert, including serving as a counterterrorism and human rights analyst at Amnesty International, a Middle East and North Africa fellow at Chatham House, and as a political officer with the UK's Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And then last but not least, we have Bret Schafer. He is the Alliance for Securing Democracy's Media and Digital Disinformation Fellow. As an expert in computational propaganda, Bret has been interviewed and appeared in several news publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, NPR, CNN, and Al Jazeera. So before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping rules. This webinar is on the record, so you can use and share the content of it as you wish. There's also a Q&A function that you'll see in the middle of your Zoom console, and we'll use that to take your questions. So please, throughout the conversation, plug in your questions. We'll take them after the moderated discussion is complete. And with that, I'm going to start with my first question. And this one I will pose to Dina. Dina, the proliferation of bots, fake accounts, and malign disinformation campaigns by both state and non-state actors alike have increased significantly over the last several years. Accounts have participated in what Facebook calls coordinated inauthentic behavior. We have seen countries from Saudi Arabia to Russia and non-state actors and terrorist groups participate in this. So can you break down a bit of what is meant when we talk about this kind of behavior?
Yeah, absolutely, Emerita. First of all, I just wanted to thank everybody on the call. It's always such a pleasure to engage with our partners at the Soufan Center. It's always such a pleasure to also be able to talk to you about such pertinent and up and coming topics. So just first of all, because tech is what always fails us, thumbs up, am I coming in live and you can all hear me? Okay, great. I'm gonna assume that that's a no, all good. So to your point, Emerita, one of the things that we look at whenever we're addressing abusive actors is the way in which they are using our tool. So the ways we do that are twofold. But one of those approaches is to look at the content, and you see this a lot when you're looking at my team, which is the Dangerous Organizations and Counterterrorism team. We are looking at organizations that are the worst of the worst. You're talking your ISIS, your Al-Qaeda, Taliban, but also organizations that we deem to be terrorist actors as well, that include Combat 18 and white supremacist orgs, neo-Nazi organizations. So for those organizations where you can clearly delineate the kind of content that they're sharing, a lot of their content has logos, symbols, slogan, in-group, out-group discussions. But then there is the behavioral part of things. When we're looking at the behavioral part of things, it really does touch on all kinds of inauthentic behavior. But at Facebook, we look at two kinds. We're looking at coordinated inauthentic behavior. We're looking at inauthentic behavior as a whole. We're also looking at, to your earlier point, foreign government interference in one way or another. So I'm happy to break those down as well for all of us, just so that we're all speaking the same lingo. What do we mean when we say CIB? So for Facebook, when we look at a group of users that are utilizing coordinated efforts to either manipulate public debate or aim to rally around a strategic cause where they're using fake accounts, and the fake accounts are really central to their operations. These activities are looked at not just from the perspective of international actors, but we also see this for domestic actors. So one of the things that we've always discussed is, tale as old as time, state actors trying to utilize tactics of using and abusing media. But now you're really seeing both domestic actors and fringe groups like terrorist organizations or hate groups utilize this. So from our perspective, we're looking at accounts that are trying to either mislead individuals, they're trying to utilize fake accounts to move forward a strategic goal, or they are coordinating not just fake accounts, they're coordinating real accounts to rally around a misleading cause. So a cause that is built around misinformation or fake news. So that's a pretty basic intro as to the two types of approaches, that content-based approach and the behavioral-based approach.
Thank you, Dina. That's really helpful. And I think we'll get to later on this coordinated approach of sort of fake accounts and real accounts, sort of those accounts that are sort of authenticated, you know, with the check mark, for example, on Twitter or Facebook. So we'll get into that. So there's been several instances of how foreign state-sponsored disinformation activities and coordinated inauthentic and authentic behavior are used to threaten journalists, elected leaders, government officials, as well as dissenters, activists, and you name it. I'll turn to Dexter now. Dexter, you've written about a live case study about how this has happened to our founder, Ali Soufan. He was on the receiving end of a very sophisticated disinformation campaign whose false narratives actually mirrored a credible threat that he had been briefed on weeks prior by the US government. And you wrote about this in your recent piece in The New Yorker, is the Saudi government plotting against another US-based critic? Can you walk us through some of this case?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. Yeah, what a weird case. Well, I'll sort of walk it through what happened to Ali. I mean, I think and I'll probably get some of the dates wrong here, but in March, he got a call from the CIA, and they said, look, we have credible information that there is a plot by Al-Qaeda against you, presumably to kill you. And so he kind of took that, and then within a couple of weeks began this campaign on social media. And I think you guys basically found that not terribly difficult to follow back to Saudi Arabia. First to Saudi Arabia, the country, the people who were tweeting. They started with this guy named Hussein Al-Gawi, who claims to be a Saudi journalist. Not really clear what he really is. But so as we looked at that, he was tweeting against Ali, and then everything he was tweeting was being magnified like a zillion times by, you know, various bots. And so the stuff was just going everywhere. And first it started, you know, it was kind of innocuous, and then it got really threatening and then super dark. You're going to end up in a garbage dump. You know, the end is near. And what I think what was really remarkable is two things. First, that we were able to trace this back to the Saudi state. That one of the guys making a video is literally an employee of the Saudi Ministry of Education. And we found him, you know, we pinpointed him, and that video has been downloaded more than 100,000 times. And that, I think the other thing that was so disturbing about what we found was that the people who were going after Ali were essentially the same people who went after Jamal, and they were doing it in exactly the same way. Jamal Khashoggi. They did it in the same way. They were using the same words. You know, you're going to end up in a garbage dump. The end is near. It was the same people. And so if you take those things, and it's basically, it looks like it's connected to the Saudi government, and we all know what happened to Jamal. It's really scary. And I would say one last thing, which is just, I mean, talking about a flat learning curve. I mean, you know, when Jamal Khashoggi was killed and murdered in the most horrific way, you know, basically everybody in the United States just pushed back on the Saudi government and said, please don't come here ever again. And, you know, here we are. We're like, we're getting ready to do it again. And so it's astounding to me how brazen, assuming it was MBS that ordered it, and it looks like it was. I'm just amazed.
Thank you. Thank you, Dexter. And yes, like you mentioned, connecting the dots. And there have been several, as we've seen over the last couple of years, several cases of this online harassment that has sort of a threat attached to it. And we know that there are other cases that exist where dissenters and critics where they've been tried to be silenced and harassed by governments, whether it's online or it's offline. Several examples of this. One that comes to mind is Egypt. And just for background, you know, there was a US citizen, Mohammed Sultan, filed a lawsuit in the US against former Egyptian Prime Minister Hazem el-Bamblawi, accusing him of overseeing the torture that Sultan endured in prison. Following that lawsuit, Sultan's family had been menaced and harassed. Some of his family members even jailed in Egyptian prisons to intimidate Sultan to drop that lawsuit. I mention this because there's a US law barring arms sales to governments engaged in this pattern of intimidation against American residents. They don't even have to be necessarily citizens, but residents. So there are laws that protect American residents against this. And there's even an effort in US Congress to bring Egypt's action to light, as well as some of the intimidation efforts that we've seen coming out of Saudi Arabia in the case of the disinformation campaign against Ali. So I'm wondering, Dexter, just a follow up, what do you make of these cases? Are you aware of other cases?
Yeah, I mean, well, that was the thing. I mean, it wasn't just Ali. There was the case of the guy in Toronto, Omar Abdulaziz. Same thing, same people, same tweets, same language, same pattern. And all roads led back to Saudi Arabia. Omar Abdulaziz is a pretty prominent Saudi critic, a critic of the monarchy, and he'd been warned by Canadian authorities not terribly long ago that he too was the target of a Saudi plot to kill him. So it's pretty clear that there's a pattern, and it's pretty clear that there's like a playbook that they're using. He's not the only one. But it's like, and they're going through the playbook, you know, page by page, which I think is you know, one of the reasons that I wanted to write the story was just to, you know, throw a spotlight on it before something happened.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dexter. I'm going to turn now to Bret. So, you know, you mentioned, Dexter, this playbook. And we know that the German Marshall Fund has researched and published extensively the ways that states, China, Russia, Iran are manipulating information, both against their own citizens, but also to influence the citizenry of other countries, political outcomes, harms against dissidents. And in some cases, we are also seeing Russia and China learning from each other's playbooks here. And I wonder now, Saudi Arabia is in this mix as well. So Bret, would you have some case studies on how their information operations are being carried out? What should we be concerned about here?
Yeah, I think one of the important things to note is they're at very different stages in terms of their ability to influence Western audiences on social media. So, Russia has had a significant presence on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube for the better part of a decade. So they have this sort of very significant influence infrastructure. And by that, I mean, both from the overt, so RT and Sputnik, RT's account is very well on YouTube, but also their diplomats on Twitter. And then, of course, the covert operations. So this is the Internet Research Agency. This is the GRU and SVR running fake accounts. But then there's also the gray area. And this is where I think it gets very complicated, because you have, in the sort of gray space, you have these outlets that have sort of tenuous connections back to the Kremlin. You have all of these Western influencers that RT and Sputnik give a platform to. At some level, they may be financed by them. So when you look at China and Iran, they're playing catch up a little bit. So Iran basically had no diplomats on social media or on Twitter until about 2018. So we saw 100 diplomats, Iranian diplomats, join Twitter after the American withdrawal from the JCPOA. On the China side, 75% of the diplomats that we monitor have joined Twitter in the last year and a half. Both of them have started some of these covert operations, so using coordinated and authentic behavior. But it's this gray space, again, where it gets complicated and where we see Iran and China not have the infrastructure set up the way Russia does. So that we actually see China and Iran leveraging those same influencers. So we look at all of their retweets, all of their mentions, and it's the same characters on the Russia side as we see on the China and Iran side. And it's the same outlets. So the same ones who were doubting MH17, who are attacking people looking into the Skripal poisoning, they're the same ones putting out stuff about Uyghur detention camps. So there's this kind of convergence there. But a couple case studies to look at. One, I think, is when we saw at the beginning of the kind of coronavirus outbreak in the US, where there was a Chinese diplomat named Zhao Lijian, who's the foreign ministry spokesperson, and he put out a tweet essentially suggesting that coronavirus originated in the US at Fort Detrick. His link, his source there, was Global Research Canada, which was one of the 7 websites that the Global Engagement Center at the State Department recently put in a report talking about their links to the Kremlin. We saw this also with the protests in Hong Kong, where we saw an American journalist who appears often on RT. He was actually on a platform that is financed in part by the Kremlin, talking about the fact that protesters in Hong Kong were being funded by the Ned, that they were all sort of Western stooges. And then, of course, you saw Chinese diplomats latch onto that, tweet out that video saying, look, even independent American voices are saying that this is all sort of a Western hoax. But I think kind of the worst example, and this goes to the gray area, was the targeting of the journalist Jessica Aro in Finland. So Jessica Aro was one of the first reporters to look into the Internet Research Agency. This is back way before we knew anything about their efforts to influence the election in 2016. And she was targeted by, pro-Kremlin Finnish trolls. So she was smeared through some of these blogs and websites in Finland. They dug up like a drug arrest she had in her 20s, provocative pictures of her partying on a beach. But they also, this jumped offline. So she was getting text messages, she told me, claiming to be from her long dead father. She was getting phone calls from cell numbers in Ukraine where she'd pick up and she'd just hear gunfire in the background. And I think that all goes to how this is really complicated to moderate and regulate, because the most aggressive trolling that we see, including in our own work, what comes back at us, is in this gray space. And these are often American citizens or European citizens who are just being given a platform by these states. But it's not like a binary thing, that this is like a purely foreign-backed information operation or smear campaign. There's sort of a melding of the two. And that's where I think it gets very challenging in terms of policy solutions, or even how it's regulated or moderated within a social media company.
Thanks, Brett. No, it's super interesting. I think you mentioned, the convergence and some of the same tactics being played, but also this gray area where it's hard to tell who's doing what, right? I think I want to turn to Dina really quickly, just based on the cases discussed by Bret and Dexter. Social media platforms, including Facebook and Twitter, have been actively used and exploited for the benefit of these operations, including, it being difficult to tell what is inauthentic activity and platform manipulation, especially when it intersects with organic, real human behaviors online. So you see this gray area. And I'm wondering if you could speak more to this phenomenon and how it's manifesting, particularly on Facebook.
Yeah, absolutely. And to echo both the points that Dexter and Bret and you've made, Emerita, this is becoming a much more, this is becoming a melding pot of OPSEC, really. We're looking at different ways in which this version of statecraft is really mutating, and we're seeing this evolve to not just the trends that state actors are using, but also dangerous organizations and even in certain situations, criminal orgs. So we're really seeing this interplay of different tactics that are coming up. And when we address this from a Facebook perspective, we take a few approaches. The first one is from a tooling perspective. So when you're looking at content that is coming in, you're really able to identify a few indicators that we have stolen from, I will say, our partners in the safety and security world or the spam world, to see how bots are popping up and how they're using email accounts or phone numbers or similar, let's say, dates of birth to register. We're also looking at the way in which they manifest. One of the tactics that a lot of you will be familiar with that's used across the board by bot creators, but also by actors like ISIS, is the creation of multiple different accounts in order to lay them dormantly in the background and then utilize them if your main account is taken down, or you find that you have been discovered as part of a network in one of the first accounts, and then you're mutating and moving over to that other account. And so we're looking at these kind of factors to say, okay, you created 6 accounts within the same day from the same IP address, and you happen to have 500 friends within the first 2 hours. I mean, I view myself as a very friendly person, but I'm not even I am that popular. So when you're looking at that kind of indicator, it's a clear indicator that you are in some way, shape, or form inauthentic. So that's from an automated identification of abusive and spammy accounts. But we're also looking at the content that people are sharing. We have pretty powerful tools that are able to image and video match. Now, I will put a caveat in here to say all of these tools are work in progress. None of them are perfect. But we do use image and video matching tools to say if we see organizations and groups and networks sharing a piece of propaganda, a piece of disinformation, and especially when it comes to things like dangerous, really graphic content, we can plug that into programming that will find matches to certain percentiles of accuracy. We sometimes refer to them as fuzzy matching if somebody has, in the age of Instagram, added a filter to these videos, added an emoji to these images. So one of the additional tactics is this ability to find content that's being distributed by networks and then image and video match it. We also have tools around text identification. So this is used a lot within the space of counterterrorism, but we also utilize that in other abuse types, including looking at inauthentic behavior as a whole. If we are seeing that there is a specific kind of text that's being circulated, a quote, or sometimes a text relayed onto an image, we can, to a certain extent, to certain accurate percentiles, find that content. And then an additional tactic that we've applied over the last couple of years is something we call fanning out and then strategic network disruptions. So effectively what that is every now and then we come to find a pretty overt propaganda dissemination or coordinated and authentic leadership focal node. And that is an area where we are able to, in whether it be chats or whether it be closed or secret groups, our investigators, and we have entire teams, we have over 3,500 people working on safety and security alone. We've got 350 people working on counterterrorism and dangerous organizations. All of these are built around people with expertise in their fields. And when it comes to CT, counterterrorism, but also with inauthentic behavior, we've got teams that are experts in investigating this kind of implicit and explicit threats. And once they have found a group of seeds, a group of users that are leading this kind of inauthentic behavior, they then do what we call a fan out, by which they are looking at the friends of those organizations. They're looking at the groups that they're adminning. They're looking at the chats that they have started. And then they are mapping out this network as a whole. And then at one point in time, we take it all down and we make it go dark at once. That is twofold. That gives it sends a clear message that Facebook is not a place that you want to be doing this. But secondly, it also allows us to monitor what happens in the aftermath. So once you take down content, that's one thing. But when you are looking at networks of users, that is a whole other approach by which you can then monitor the after effects of that. And then another, outside of the tooling and what we're doing in-house, we've also really started to lean into this portion of our work that is built around transparency. So one of the things that the coordinated and authentic behavior team, and as well as my team at within the counterterrorism and dangerous orgs world works on, is being transparent about when we take down these kinds of networks. So as many of you might know, but for those of you who don't, please feel free to reach out to me and I'll put you in touch with Nathaniel Glacier, who is leading a lot of our work around this. We go public every month with a report on the networks that we've taken down. In 2019 alone, we took over 50 networks worldwide that were engaging in coordinated and authentic behavior. And in all of these cases, we go public with a report on our website, and I'm happy to send it out to share all the insights that we have gotten. So for example, in our last summary from July, we found that there were a total number of 798 accounts, Facebook accounts removed, partnered up with 259 Instagram accounts, as well as a myriad of pages and groups. And we track that. We track that because we are then able to see how well we're doing, but we're able to then understand what the abuse is and how the abuse is changing, how the abuse types are evolving and mutating. And then we also partner up with external academic and think tank partners who do their own analysis of our findings, and they do their own analysis of tracking these networks and how they've evolved and what tools they're using. So that all of those different approaches are the way in which we're starting to take on this obstacle. And happy to put you guys in touch with all the right POCs.
Dina, thank you so much. That was such a great overview of the anatomy of, I guess, the beginnings of what a networked strategic information sort of influence campaign might come out to be online from the very beginnings and how it sprouted. So super helpful. And I think we'll get back to a lot of those points that you raised in the question and answer. I do want to remind people that we'll go to questions soon. So please start adding your questions to the Q&A function. I wanted to jump quickly to Dexter for his views as a journalist working in this space. Dexter, you're known for your award-winning pieces and truth-telling. I was wondering if you could share with us a little bit about how the landscape as a journalist has changed over the years, especially as harassment, both online and offline, have been increasingly targeted towards truth-tellers, dissenters, writers like yourself.
Well, I mean, fortunately, and I'm knocking on wood here, I've not been the target of anything like that. But no, I mean, it's just, look, it's like a whole other world. And, you know, I'm like most journalists, I'm a liberal arts major. And so, it's hard because this stuff is really, you know, it's the God is in the details in this stuff, and it's in the sort of technical details, and it's really, really hard to navigate. It's hard to navigate that world. I mean, it's hard anyway. And so it's changed enormously. And so I rely more and more on people who understand this stuff, because I spent, you know, this is like a year and a half ago, but I spent a long time, for instance, on a story about whether the Trump campaign had been talking covertly to a Russian bank before the election. And, you know, and I worked with some people who I think some of you probably know, but God, that stuff was incredibly complicated. And you know, it's not generally, I'm usually, I'm used to talking to people and not, you know, looking at spreadsheets with numbers on them. And so it's been a very abrupt change, but like, you know, one that you have to do, because that's where everybody is.
Yeah. I want to ask one more question before we pivot to Q&A, and it's related to solutions. So much of the solutions that we've seen regarding online malinformation and harassment campaigns has been reactive, taking down accounts and websites from social media platforms after much of the damage has already been done. As Dina mentioned, there are, like the studying of these networks and how they're broken down, et cetera, but we've seen a lot of these takedowns. And when you have state-sponsored threats and harassment, as we've discussed, it brings on a new troubling element to this wider problem. And there are so many entities that are involved that have a responsibility to respond to this, including governments, social media platforms, civil society, and others. So this is a question, sort of a lightning round for each panelist, and maybe we can start with Bret. What are your thoughts on more systematic approaches to addressing these information operations?
Yeah, I think one of the problems is we've relied too much on Facebook and Twitter and Google to do the work of enforcing this space. I mean, I think there's a lot that the platforms need to do, but at the end of the day, the worst thing they can do is deplatform accounts or take down pages, which is disruptive, yes, but it's not a true deterrence because all the bad actors have to do is sort of reorganize, get their operations back up and running, which again, yes, it takes time, but there's no real kind of penalty that Facebook can levy against a network of bad actors, whether that's state-backed or some of these sort of for-profit disinfo as a service type of companies. So I do think there needs to be a law enforcement element to this and going after the sort of the hubs of disinformation. Because if you're just trying to pick off every bot account, it's an impossible task if you're trying to take out the little sort of like the little nodes as opposed to the big node. So I do think there's some opportunities here, and this doesn't require necessarily kind of reinventing the wheel. We have laws on the books against things like impersonation. We have laws on the books against things like consumer fraud, which almost all of these groups are engaged in at some level. So I think the extent to which we can make this more of a law enforcement priority, and Michelle Straw, who I think is on the call, we talked about this in Doha, she's very good on this topic, but of really treating these like, international criminal organizations and going after the hubs of them and really, taking a chunk out of the financial incentives that are involved here for some of these groups. I think that's one of the options we need to look at more closely.
Thanks, Bret. Can I ask Dina to answer the same question?
Of course. I agree with Bret in many ways. The onus on social media companies really is to upskill all of the people that work in-house to a certain extent, but then we do rely on all of the stakeholders around us. But then to also supplement some of the work that we're doing is to really shed light on these tactics, because if we keep all this information to ourselves, it's very partners like Dexter, for partners like Bret to really understand these tactics in the minutiae and the details, and understand how best to then respond to this. So I think leaning into the transparency around this kind of work for us is really important. But then there's also partnering up with other tech sector partners. So part of what we do around these strategic network disruptions is to try and share as much information as we legally can with partners at other tech companies to make sure that if there is, I mean, none of us have one app on our phones. Why would we imagine that bad actors would just be using one platform to apply this kind of misinformation? And I've mentioned that before to this group. So it's important to look at the structures that we put in place to partner. So for terrorism, for example, I believe him and his partners are on the call, but Nick Rasmussen is now heading up the GIFCT, which is a global internet forum to counter terrorism. And that's one of the areas where we've come together as an industry to share information, share indicators, share best practices. We've even started a hash sharing consortium to share digital fingerprints of known propaganda. So maybe there's areas of partnerships that are similar to that can be applied in the IO space. And then finally, the last point that I will say is to Bret's point about the whack-a-mole approach that sometimes is taken to these bots, there is something to be said about understanding that we're all put in a very difficult position when it comes to what information we can and can't share. I think there is more discussion that needs to be had with our law enforcement partners, more information that needs to be had with our civil society partners, because there is an intersection there that says, well, you're taking down journalist accounts if you're doing this as a whole. And I've heard this, I know that journalists embed themselves to try and monitor this kind of work. So there are a few areas where I think we can upskill and upscale this work.
Thanks, Dina. That's a good segue to Dexter in thinking about solutions. So wondering what you think.
Look, this is like at a really basic level. We have the United States. We are being attacked, and individuals are being attacked by states and people who are backed by states, whether it's the Saudi example that we set, or the Chinese, or the Russians. And there hasn't been much of a price for them to pay, at least that we know about. You know, where is the deterrent? And you know, the president was asked the other day about Russian influence and about warnings of Russian influence in the election, and he literally said, "I don't care." And I think I just wonder if under a different administration, a lot of this wouldn't be different, wouldn't be unfolding differently, because there would be a price to pay, a really terrible price to pay, if you engaged in this kind of behavior.
Yeah, it brings us back to some of the points made by both Dina and Bret on the law enforcement aspect to this. There needs to be a price to pay. Okay, so I think we're going to open it up to questions. I'm looking through the Q&A. Feel free to send over your questions. We have our first one from Mia Bloom. Research from Jake Shapiro and Diego Martin shows that 73% of foreign influence campaigns come from Russia, and the other 17% from China, Iran, and even Israel. Besides Russian disinformation having become partisan, how do we combat disinformation when it comes from allies and not just challengers? So I'll direct that one to Bret, who's already nodding his head.
I'm nodding because it's a tough question. I don't know. I don't have a great answer, because when you go to like sanctioning countries for some of this behavior, it's easier when it's coming from Russia, China, Iran. Way more difficult when it's coming from our democratic partners or allies. I mean, one of the cases, sort of looking at this in reverse, if you look at the Macron leaks, I mean, the key figure in pushing out Macron-related information prior to the election, and I forget when it was, 2017 maybe, was Jack Posobiec, who's an American. So you often have, you know, different individuals in democratic countries who are the key influencers to run some of these state-backed campaigns, or just to do it you know, kind of for their own political reasons. And then that becomes way more complicated, because I'm not sure how you, you know, would sanction the UK, for example, because of the fact they have many of these sort of quasi-academics there who are key influencers in running some of the sort of, or laundering Russian disinformation. So that's a kind of meandering way of saying, I don't know how to deal with it when it's coming from allies and partners and individuals in those countries. It's more complicated. That's the best I can do.
Yeah, if I can just add, I think it's a really complicated and interesting question, because there's the element of diplomacy when you're talking about allies, right? And so I think you have a combination of obviously our diplomacy efforts, technology. You know, I think Dina's point on raising GIF-CT, like that could be an interesting space perhaps where GIF-CT can work. Any other thoughts on that question before I move on to the next? No? Okay. So this is an interesting question as well, coming from Varun Karam-Parambil. Are American private corporations likely to see a spike in the number of disinformation operations against them? And what can companies do proactively to deal with this threat? Really interesting question. I don't know if I have a taker, or perhaps I can direct.
I can take it very briefly. I don't want to kind of answer too many questions in a row, but this is the topic we actually talked about in Doha last year with the Soufan Center. You know, targeting of for-profit companies and what that can do to publicly traded companies. You know, the ability to just completely tank stock prices by pushing out a coordinated disinfo campaign. You know, you even take it down to the mom and pop level of the ability to, you know, wipe out business at the very local level if you run sort of these targeted smear campaigns of like Yelp reviews or TripAdvisor reviews. I mean, all of the research has shown like a drop and a half star for a review equates to just a huge loss of business. So the ability to run that at the very sort of micro level. And again, there are all of these for-profit companies who will do that for you. You don't have to have any technical sophistication. If you want to know how to manipulate search results on Google, you just Google it, and they'll give you 50 companies who will do it for a very small fee. So you can do it at a very small level, but then when you talk about, you know, at the sort of nation state level, the ability to attack the energy sector or something like that through coordinated disinfo campaigns. I think it's a really understudied element of it. And I wish we'd spend more time focusing on it, because it would divorce this conversation from the sort of political partisan aspect that is just inherent if you talk about it in terms of like influencing a presidential campaign.
Absolutely. It sounds like a major research gap. So I'm going to point this next question to Dina. A question from Ian Gray from Office of Congressman Malinowski. Can you say a bit more about what Facebook is doing to limit the algorithmic amplification of white nationalist, anti-Semitic, harmful, conspiratorial content on the platform? Separately, I understand from ADL and other organizations that Facebook is still proactively recommending certain groups to users that are related to white nationalism. What is Facebook doing to limit these problematic recommendations?
So first off, I would thank Ian immensely for his question. This is an area where we know we are still working around and learning in a very much it's a needed area for us to excel at, and it's a big portion of what I do on a day-to-day portion of my job. So when we are addressing abusive actors, and I will say we don't just look at anti-Semitic, white nationalist, neo-Nazi organizations as a separate portion. We're actually looking at them based on our definition of hate orgs, but also based off of our definition of terrorist actors. You don't need to, we are trying to stay as far away from looking at just this naming and terminology approach. We're looking at it from a behavioral approach. So one of the things that we do in-house is that we have an openly available definition of terrorist actors and hateful actors. And we assess each organization based off of that definition. To date, we have designated over 250 neo-Nazi and white nationalist and white supremacist organizations. Part and parcel of what we're also doing is applying those same tools. So we're applying the image and video matching to memes. And that's one of the things that we're starting to learn too, is we're needing to build our tools in a way that are responsive in a faster manner. One of the points that I usually really like to flesh out is a little bit of historical context. When our team was started, the team was started in 2015, really looking at the threats coming in from ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban. And when you look at these organizations, you see that they are built around wanting to reach as wide of an audience as possible. They are systematic and organized, and they have logos and they have processes by which they disseminate their propaganda. And then finally, their last aim is not to hide. Their last aim is to either achieve martyrdom or get to a place where they have reached as many people and made the biggest impact. When you then look at neo-Nazi, white supremacist, and let's say extreme content that's coming in from those folks, you are looking at a different tactic. They're not organized around one specific goal. If anything, they're trying to be as amorphous and as decentralized as humanly possible. They're also not sending out propaganda in the logoed and symboled way that we have seen before with extremist jihadists. They are actually just leaning into the memification of it all. And they are trying to stay on the platform as long as possible. They're not trying to get arrested or achieve martyrdom. They're trying to spread this information as long as they possibly can. And so we've changed our tools to look at that manner, trying to identify terms and names which we can then not allow suggestions to. To Ian's point, we've not always been very successful at that. They change their names so often, the group names change. You've probably, most of you have probably heard that we banned the violent arms of the Boogaloo network a few weeks ago, which was an amorphous, in certain situation, violent groups. And we were trying to address the changes that they then responded with. So we applied a strategic network disruption. We were trying to block suggestions of group names in that manner. But then it changed. It went from Boogaloo to Big Igloo to the large scale outdoor gathering. Like, these are things that are morphing exponentially at a speed that we are trying to keep up with, but we're applying those same tools. We're trying to apply the image and video matching. We're partnering up with organizations like the Center for the Analysis of the Radical Right. We're partnering up with organizations like in the Institute for the Study of the International Center for the Study of Radicalization, that's also building out their own networks for this. And then they're feeding us a lot of information around the symbols, the slogans, the slurs, the in-group conversations that we're then building in and feeding into our content. The other thing that we're doing is, again, being transparent. So for the first time in the history of our transparency reports, we actually now report on how much content we take down from terrorist organizations, but also how much content we take down from hate groups and white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups. So you can track how much content we've taken down without anybody reporting it to us through our automated approaches. And that is to both help us learn and to have you hold us to account, because we're not going to ever get this perfect, but we're hoping that everybody in the community will help us get better.
No, great question, and thank you for that comprehensive answer. I think I have another question in the queue that I think both Dina and Bret may be able to take on. This comes from Jason Bazakis. Just as bad actors use multiple platforms, as Dina noted, do the panelists believe it is practical to coordinate multi-platform takedowns? For example, when Facebook coordinates a strategic disruption, could it not coordinate such action with Google, YouTube, and Twitter? What are the difficulties and benefits associated with cross-platform takedowns? And Dexter, feel free to chime in as well from your perspective.
Sure.
I'll turn, I think, perhaps to Bret, and then we can go around.
I think that's a very important element. You know, Dina, I think we talked in the call before about the fact that Twitter and Facebook and Google, I think, are doing a better job at this point coordinating some of these takedowns. I mean, we used to see, it was quite bad, actually, a couple of years ago, where we would see Twitter have a very public takedown, and a week later, you would see accounts that were directly linked to some of the accounts taken down that would still be active on other major platforms. I think the challenge comes in with how those companies interact with the platforms that aren't necessarily acting in good faith. Because a lot of this malicious behavior starts bubbling up or is pushed off to you know, the 4chans and the 8chans and the Gabs of the world, where they just don't have, well, A, they're under-resourced. I mean, they probably don't have a trust and safety team, but some of them were set up kind of for the explicit purpose to be a safe haven for these bad actors. So trying to bring them in the fold would be counterproductive, to say the least. But it's also, you know, it is a tactic we have seen when Twitter, for example, has had these massive bot takedowns. We have seen the Russian linked accounts that we look at use that as sort of the pretext to go to the accounts that follow them and say, hey, this has now become a censorship platform that the CIA is monitoring. Join us on Gab. This is a couple of years ago because Gab's not quite as relevant. But so there's an effort to sweep accounts into these more sort of closed off or less kind of policed platforms. And then I think the other challenge, but Dina could speak to this better, is that when you get to information sharing, you know, I think Google, Twitter, Facebook are probably pretty comfortable sharing with each other. I think the level of trust would drop precipitously when you talk about some of these platforms that, you know, sort of invite bad actors to play in their space. So I don't know how you deal with that problem.
Yeah, thank you for that. Dina, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure. So from my side, I could not agree more with what Bret has very astutely flagged. It is a challenge for us to say, hey, here are what the big 4 tech companies that are very well funded, that have enough money to hire a counterterrorism or you know, a information operation expert and people with years of expertise there. It's very difficult to then expect the same from a small tech company. And it's then exponentially more difficult to expect a positive response from platforms whose main goal has been built around providing a safe haven. The way that we have gone about it so far is to do 3 things, in my opinion. The first of those main 3 pillars is that we're trying to be as transparent as humanly possible about the tools that we use. And then we're also really trying to be as collaborative when it comes to sharing those tools and making them available. That's very, very easy for us to say, but when we started to practice that, for example, within the counterterrorism sphere, we made the image and video matching software available freely to organizations that wanted to join and take down terrorist content, because that costs thousands and thousands of dollars for other organizations to then pay to license that software. But that's because we were able to get at this from the content perspective, right? For terrorist content, you can get at the content. For a lot of these IO operations, you're looking at behavior. You're looking at things that are not as concrete as finding an image or a video. And then to add to that, Bret very astutely pointed out that we went through many phases in the development of the internet. One of which I value immensely, because I was a researcher in the field and in northern Sinai, looking at ISIS and tribal affiliations. I was very concerned for my security and my personally identifiable information. So that brings me to the kind of context that we can share with other tech companies, because our hands are legally tied. Rightly so, in certain situations, you don't want tech companies to be able to freely and openly share user information. That's not something we would ever want to be able to do. So there needs to be a conversation around what are the legal parameters so other tech companies are comfortable there. The other thing that we do is we fund research. We have enough financing to fund research about how these operations are manifesting. And if there are platforms that are being utilized and weaponized in this way, it's not, I find it a very uncomfortable position to have one tech company that is as financially able to do this work as we are, to point the finger at smaller tech companies. It should never be, it should never be that power dynamic, in my opinion. But there is a space for independent academics to look at this, and people like Dexter and Bret to be afforded the access to understand this a little more from our side, but also for us to fund organizations that can study this, and then on their own accord, name the platforms that need to do more work and try and work to bring them to the table. That's not to say that all of them will be willing to come to have those discussions, but at least we'll be aware, and legislators will be aware. And when you see those kind of links, we can take action on Facebook. So for certain abusive 8chan and 4chan platforms, we do not allow links to be posted on our platform if they're going to those subreddits or subchats or to certain websites. So that's something that we can do from our side as the big tech companies. We do have, to be very honest with everybody on the call, we do have conversations on the back end between our companies, our tech companies, to just say, here are the trends that we are seeing. Here are the tactics that we're seeing evolve. And it's mainly done by those expert investigative teams. And we can build off of that, but I think there is a conversation to be had, and a really important conversation to be had around data security and data portability, and how much data security needs to be protected in this case, which is super important from our side, but working around all of those obstacles.
Thank you, Dina. I have a question actually for Dexter. How has disinformation and information campaigns transformed how newsrooms operate? Do newsrooms have newsrooms sufficiently adapted to identify mis and disinformation, and what are some resources available for newsrooms?
Right. That's a hard one. I think the short answer is no. They haven't. But the tricky part is when I mean, it's the same problem. We have the same problem everybody else has, which is like, you see something online and you say, is this real? How real is this? And who is behind this? And so it's all the same. We're facing the same problem, and we all ask the same questions. But I think, no, I mean, the answer is like, nobody's prepared adequately to do it. And which leads me to, like, for instance, this isn't disinformation strictly speaking, but I've spent the last several weeks looking at the vulnerability of American election systems, particularly voter registration. And it is so terrifying. You know, we know, for instance, that the Russians penetrated election systems in all 50 states in 2016, and that's when they were facing a president who was determined to deter them. And you know, this is not something I know anything about, and so I've had to basically start from zero. And you know, there's a lot of really smart people in the nonprofit sector who like have the time and are happy to spend an hour on the phone with you, educating you. But it's really hard.
Yeah. Yeah, sounds like there's another gap there where there could be some synergy.
But the voter registration thing is really scary, just to say. It
is. So we're running out of time, but there was a really interesting question that I want to get to, posed by Josh Geltzer in the Q&A, and I'll just read it aloud and then we can direct it. If the malicious actors online are evolving so quickly in their tactics and practices, how will any of the techniques currently used by tech platforms ever catch up? In other words, doesn't it feel like some dramatically new and different approaches are needed given the pace of evolution and increasing sophistication of the bad actors? This is a great question. Do I have a volunteer? If not, I think Dina or Bret perhaps can take this on.
I'll take a shot at it, and it kind of goes back to my earlier answer of going after the leadership and the hubs of disinformation, because yes, their tactics are changing, the type of accounts, the way they would abuse platforms, but like at the end of the day, I mean, it is a growing amount of threat actors, but it does funnel up to kind of an individual and organization. If you can go after those organizations, they're changing tactics, you know, it's important to understand and you have to be able to recognize, but you want to kind of wipe out the leadership. I mean, it's almost, you know, the way we looked at the mafia, where you're not trying to constantly take out the people on the street and the various businesses that they're trying to manipulate. You're trying to kind of funnel up to the leadership and wipe them out at the top. In which case, you know, when you really disrupt something, which I mean is more than deplatforming accounts, it makes it more challenging for them to constantly evolve and to continue to stay a step ahead of the companies. So it's easier said than done for sure, but that would be the sort of one suggestion I would have.
Thanks, Bret. Dina, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, Joshua's picked on something that is very, very much on the top of all of our minds. It is a constant game of catch up. It is, we have never in the history of our platform been able to stop and say, yeah, we fixed terrorism, we fixed information operations. It's not going to happen at any point soon. I think we are starting to learn what the best practices are when it comes to collaboration. I think that's a point that both Dexter and Bret have made today, and I think it's something that's really hit home for us over the last couple of years. But there is something to also be said about it. There is something to be said about the fact that it is sometimes left to tech companies to make decisions around these organizations and to adjudicate who is the bad actor and who isn't the bad actor in a way that I can tell you sometimes it scares me. And this is because I never thought that I would be working in a tech company. My background is just a researcher on the ground. If you had told me this would have been my job 2 years ago, I would have laughed. And so part of me is still very aware of the responsibility that falls on tech companies to adjudicate this kind of stuff. And I think there is an avenue for more partnership with leadership, for more, for asking for more guidance from our partners in government to say, hey, in a lot of situations, Facebook will make a call to deem a white supremacist organization as a terrorist organization, and then years down the line, the governments would take that action. And it seems like it's somewhat reversed, but I feel like there is space for us to learn there, and there is space for us to learn from experts, academics, our you know, law enforcement partners, or our partners like Dexter and like Bret, and we're willing to be there at the table. And again, as I mentioned, Emerita can put you in touch with me, but we have entire teams that work around this, and I'm under no delusion that we are not in a very privileged position to put our money where our mouth is, really.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. It looks like we have reached the end of the webinar. So I didn't want to cut off the questions. I thought they were so great, but I wanted to first thank our distinguished experts for joining us on this call. I think we've highlighted, you know, several gaps and opportunities with respect to influence operations, especially leading up to elections, in terms of leading up to understanding how state and non-state actors are using the online space for harassment and what we can do there. And I think, you know, as one of the questions, one of the people in the queue raised, we are outpaced. So we have to continuously try and outpace those who are doing these kinds of campaigns. So the work is cut out for us. But I want to thank you all on behalf of the Soufan Center. Thank you all to attendees for joining us. We will keep up the conversation. Please follow us online, follow our research, and thank you once again. Bye-bye.